In the heart of 10th century France, during the High Middle Ages, a significant transformation was reshaping the political and social landscape. The once mighty Carolingian dynasty, which had maintained relative stability across vast territories, was experiencing a dramatic decline in central authority. This power vacuum gave rise to one of the most defining characteristics of medieval Europe, the feudal system. The fragmentation of royal power was particularly evident in the French territories. Where once a single authority commanded respect and obedience, now countless local lords established their own spheres of influence. This decentralization was most pronounced in Aquitaine, the southern region of France, which would become the cradle of revolutionary peace movements. Life in this period was marked by constant uncertainty and violence. The countryside echoed with the clash of swords and the clanking of armor, while pillaging and warfare between rival nobles left villages in smoldering ruins. Smoke from burned settlements would often darken the skies, serving as a grim reminder of the perpetual state of conflict. Stone castles, perched strategically atop hills and mountains, dotted the landscape. These imposing structures served a dual purpose. They were both essential defensive fortifications and powerful symbols of local authority. The social contrast was stark and visible in every aspect of daily life. Noble warriors, clad in elaborate armor and expensive war gear, commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Their magnificent attire, often adorned with family crests and symbols of their lineage, stood in sharp contrast to the common peasants, who wore simple, rough-wool tunics that reflected their modest means and social status. The breakdown of centralized authority had created a complex web of allegiances and counter-allegiances. Local lords, now effectively independent rulers in their own territories, frequently engaged in private wars with their neighbors. These conflicts, often sparked by disputes over land, inheritance, or personal honor, could persist for generations, creating a cycle of violence that seemed impossible to break. The landscape itself became a testament to this turbulent era. Agricultural fields were often left untended as peasants sought refuge from marauding warriors. Trade routes became treacherous, with merchants forced to pay multiple tolls to different lords for safe passage through their territories. The Church, witnessing this deterioration of social order, found itself in a unique position to intervene, leading to the emergence of the Peace and Truce of God movements. This period marked a crucial turning point in medieval history, as the traditional structures of power were redefined, and new forms of social organization emerged from the chaos of the collapsing Carolingian order. The atmospheric tension of the era was palpable, with the constant threat of violence hanging over every aspect of daily life, creating an environment that would ultimately necessitate significant social and political innovation. The geographical setting of southern France, particularly Aquitaine, proved crucial for these developments. Its distance from the traditional centers of royal power, combined with its rich religious traditions and strong ecclesiastical presence, made it the perfect breeding ground for new approaches to maintaining social order and controlling violence. If you are passionate about the Middle Ages and want to embark on this historical journey with us, leave a like on the video and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel so you don't miss any fascinating content. The Peace of God movement brought forth remarkable religious leaders who would fundamentally reshape medieval society's approach to violence. Among these influential figures, Bishop Guy of Le Puy emerged as a pioneering force. Known for his commanding presence and diplomatic skills, Guy leveraged his position to organize some of the earliest peace councils in the late 10th century. His innovative approach involved gathering large crowds of commoners and clergy, creating a powerful demonstration of popular support that even the most hardened warriors found difficult to ignore. Abbot Odilo of Cluny stands as another towering figure in this movement. Leading the prestigious Cluny Abbey, Odilo wielded unprecedented spiritual authority across Europe. His monastery network became a powerful force for peace, as he systematically implemented new rules and customs that promoted nonviolence. Under his leadership, Cluny developed into a center of intellectual and spiritual reform, where the concepts of peace and social justice were carefully developed and documented. Archbishop Aymon of Bourges also played a crucial role, organizing massive peace assemblies where sacred relics were displayed to enhance their spiritual authority. These gatherings, known as councils, combined religious ceremony with practical peacekeeping measures, creating a new framework for conflict resolution. The movement faced fierce opposition from the warrior nobility, who viewed violence as their birthright and primary means of maintaining social status. Counts, dukes, and knights had built their entire identity around martial prowess and the right to wage private wars. Many saw the church's intervention as a direct threat to their way of life and social standing. Among these nobles, historical records paint a picture of various resistant figures. Count William III of Aquitaine, while initially skeptical, eventually became a supporter of the movement, demonstrating how some nobles could be won over to the cause of peace. His conversion became a powerful example for other nobles to follow. The chronicles of the time tell us of numerous other ecclesiastical figures who contributed to the movement's success. Bishop Gerald of Limoges, for instance, developed innovative methods for enforcing peace agreements, including the use of public oaths and community surveillance systems. Archbishop Burchard of Lyon utilized his political connections to strengthen the movement's influence among the highest levels of society. While not historically documented, the figure of Count Roland of Aquitaine represents a composite of many nobles of the period. These warriors initially resisted ecclesiastical authority, but gradually began to question their traditional roles. Many experienced profound personal transformations as they witnessed the devastating impact of their violence on local communities. Some even became active supporters of the peace movements, using their influence to convince fellow nobles to accept the new restrictions. The interaction between these religious reformers and the warrior nobility created a complex dynamic of resistance and adaptation. Church leaders had to carefully balance their moral authority with practical considerations, often negotiating compromises that would be acceptable to both sides. They developed sophisticated theological arguments that reframed the role of warriors in Christian society, promoting the ideal of the righteous warrior who protected the weak rather than exploited them. This period also saw the emergence of a new class of mediators, often minor clergy or educated nobles, who specialized in conflict resolution and peace negotiations. These individuals played a crucial role in translating the high principles of the peace of God into practical solutions for local disputes. The success of these protagonists in implementing the peace of God movement would have lasting implications for medieval society, establishing new norms of behavior and creating institutional frameworks for conflict resolution that would influence European society for centuries to come. The fundamental tension between secular and religious power during the High Middle Ages created a complex web of conflicts that would reshape medieval society. At its core, this struggle represented a pivotal moment in European history, where the Church actively sought to assert its moral authority over a warrior aristocracy that had long operated by its own rules of violence and honor. The warrior culture of medieval nobility was deeply ingrained in every aspect of aristocratic life. From childhood, young nobles were trained in the arts of war, taught to value martial prowess, and educated in a code of honor that often prioritized violence as a means of conflict resolution. This martial ethos was not merely about fighting. It was a complete social system that defined nobility, honor, and status through the lens of military capability. However, this culture of violence stood in stark contrast to the Church's growing vision of a Christian society. The medieval Church, gaining increasing influence and organizational sophistication, began to articulate a different view of social order, one based on protection of the vulnerable and limitation of unnecessary violence. This created a fundamental ideological conflict. How could a society reconcile the warrior ethos of its ruling class with Christian principles of peace and protection of the weak? The Council of Charu in 989 marked a watershed moment in this struggle. This first Peace of God Council represented an innovative approach to controlling violence. The Church leaders gathered not only religious figures but also common people, creating a powerful demonstration of popular support for peace. At Charu, the Church formally declared divine protection for three categories: the poor, the clergy, and church property. This declaration was revolutionary. It essentially claimed that certain acts of violence, previously considered legitimate by the warrior class, were now violations of divine law. The conflict manifested in several key ways. Firstly, there was the practical challenge of enforcement. The Church had to develop new mechanisms to ensure compliance with its peace declarations. This led to the creation of peace militias, systems of oaths and pledges, and the use of spiritual penalties like excommunication. Secondly, there was the ideological battle over the nature of nobility itself. The Church began promoting a new ideal of Christian knighthood, where true nobility was demonstrated through protection of the weak rather than through aggressive warfare. This directly challenged traditional noble values and self-identity. Thirdly, there was the struggle over jurisdiction. The Peace of God movement represented the Church's attempt to establish authority over matters previously considered purely secular. This created tension with both local nobles and emerging royal power structures. The narrative of this conflict was punctuated by dramatic confrontations and gradual transformations. Some nobles violently resisted these new restrictions on their traditional rights, while others began to embrace a new vision of Christian knighthood. The Church's success varied by region and over time, but the movement gradually reshaped the relationship between violence, authority, and legitimacy in medieval society. What made this conflict particularly significant was its role in developing new concepts of law and order. The Peace of God movement represented one of the first systematic attempts to establish universal rules of conduct that applied even to the most powerful members of society. It helped establish the principle that violence, even by legitimate authorities, should be subject to moral and legal constraints. The resolution of these conflicts was never complete or absolute. Instead, it led to a new synthesis of religious and secular authority, where the warrior culture of the nobility was gradually transformed rather than eliminated. The ideal of the Christian knight, powerful but restrained, martial but protective, emerged as a compromise between these competing visions of social order. This central conflict between secular and religious power, between the culture of violence and the need for peace, would continue to shape European society long after the initial Peace of God movement. Its legacy can be seen in the development of chivalric codes, international law, and modern concepts of just war and human rights. Medieval daily life was profoundly shaped by the omnipresent threat of violence. In these turbulent times, peasants lived in constant fear, their existence marked by uncertainty and vulnerability. Their small thatched homes, clustered around the lord's castle or monastery, offered little protection against armed raiders. Each morning, as they ventured into the fields, they faced the risk of encountering armed bands who could destroy or steal their harvest, the precious sustenance they needed to survive the harsh winter months. Merchants and traders faced equally perilous conditions. The roads connecting medieval towns and cities were dangerous thoroughfares where brigands and rogue knights waited to ambush travelers. These merchants, carrying valuable goods like spices, textiles, and metalwork, often traveled in large caravans for protection, but even this precaution didn't guarantee their safety. Many chose to travel only during specific times of the year when the weather and daylight hours were more favorable, or when they knew local lords would provide protection, for a fee of course. Even sacred spaces weren't spared from violence. Monasteries and churches, despite their religious significance, became targets due to their wealth and resources. These institutions often housed valuable religious artifacts, precious metals, and stored food supplies that attracted raiders. Monks and priests lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, with many religious buildings eventually being fortified with walls and watchtowers, a stark testament to the period's instability. The medieval social structure was rigidly divided into three distinct orders: the bellators, those who fight; the orators, those who pray; and the labrators, those who work. The nobility, trained from childhood in the art of warfare, saw violence as their birthright and primary means of solving disputes. The clergy, positioned between heaven and earth, wielded spiritual authority and gradually developed their role as peacekeepers. The peasants, comprising the vast majority of the population, bore the brunt of this violent society while working to sustain it through their labor. This tripartite division wasn't merely theoretical, it manifested in every aspect of daily life. Clothing, diet, housing, and even manner of speech clearly marked one's social position. Nobles resided in stone castles or fortified manors, dining on refined foods and wearing expensive clothing. The clergy lived in monasteries or church buildings, following a regulated daily routine of prayer and religious duties. Peasants inhabited simple wooden houses with thatched roofs, surviving on basic foods like bread, pottage, and occasional meat. The church's unique position in this social hierarchy allowed it to act as a mediator between classes. Through the Peace and Truce of God movements, it leveraged its spiritual authority to protect the vulnerable and regulate violence. The Church's intervention marked a crucial shift in medieval society, attempting to transform the warrior nobility's concept of honor from one based purely on martial prowess to one that included the protection of the weak and respect for sacred times and places. This complex social tapestry reveals how medieval society struggled to balance the practical need for warriors with the desire for peace and stability. The daily reality of violence shaped everything from architecture to social customs, from economic activities to religious practices, creating a world where survival often depended on the delicate interplay between protection and submission, power and faith. If you're enjoying the story so far, what part surprised you the most? Comment below what you think about how these events changed the course of the Middle Ages. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel to follow our next explorations. The evolution of medieval society's approach to violence was marked by three transformative events that fundamentally changed the social and political landscape of medieval Europe. Each of these moments represents a crucial step in the Church's growing influence over medieval warfare and social order. The Council of Charu in 989 marked the first major breakthrough in the Peace of God movement. In the Grand Abbey of Charu, amid the display of sacred relics and the solemn atmosphere of religious authority, bishops and abbots gathered to address the escalating violence plaguing their lands. The council proclaimed divine protection for the most vulnerable members of society, the peasants, the clergy, and church property. This proclamation was not merely a religious decree. It represented the first systematic attempt to establish rules of conduct for warfare in medieval Europe. The council threatened excommunication for those who attacked unarmed peasants, stole cattle, or destroyed churches. This revolutionary concept, that even warriors had to answer to a higher moral authority, sent shockwaves through the feudal system. The establishment of the Truce of God in 1027 took these protective measures even further. This remarkable initiative prohibited fighting on specific holy days and during religious seasons. The truce initially banned warfare from Saturday evening to Monday morning, honoring the Lord's Day. Over time, this protection expanded to cover major religious festivals and the entire seasons of Advent and Lent. The practical impact was significant. Agricultural work could proceed without interruption, merchants could travel more safely, and communities could observe religious festivities without fear of attack. This temporal restriction on violence represented an unprecedented assertion of church authority over military matters, effectively creating periods of mandatory peace in the medieval calendar. The most dramatic transformation came with the redirection of knightly violence toward the Crusades. The Church, recognizing that completely suppressing the warrior culture was impossible, ingeniously channeled this martial energy toward what it deemed a holy purpose. Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade in 1095 marked a watershed moment. The Church offered warriors a path to salvation through military service, transforming the identity of the medieval knight from a mere warrior into a soldier of Christ. This redirection of violence had far-reaching consequences. It exported local conflicts to distant lands, unified previously warring nobles under religious banners, and created a new ideal of Christian knighthood that combined martial prowess with religious devotion. This transformation of knightly violence also gave rise to the military orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These organizations embodied the new ideal of the warrior monk, combining religious vows with military service. They established a code of conduct that would eventually evolve into the chivalric ideals we associate with medieval knighthood. The cumulative effect of these three pivotal events was profound. They established the Church as a legitimate arbiter of violence, created practical mechanisms for controlling warfare, and provided an acceptable outlet for martial energy. These changes didn't eliminate violence from medieval society, but they began the long process of civilizing warfare and establishing rules of combat that would eventually influence modern international law. The legacy of these events extends far beyond their immediate historical context. The Peace of God movement's attempt to protect civilians during warfare foreshadowed modern humanitarian law. The Truce of God's temporal restrictions on violence established the precedent that warfare could be regulated by universal rules. The transformation of knightly violence through the Crusades demonstrated how martial culture could be adapted and redirected rather than simply suppressed. Together, these events represent crucial steps in humanity's ongoing effort to balance the reality of conflict with the need for social order and protection of the vulnerable. The Church's campaign for peace during the medieval period was not merely a political or social movement. It was a sophisticated cultural revolution that employed powerful symbols, rituals, and artistic expressions to reshape society's understanding of violence and Christian virtue. This transformation manifested through various cultural and intellectual channels, creating lasting impacts on medieval civilization. The Church masterfully orchestrated elaborate peace ceremonies that combined theatrical elements with profound religious significance. During peace councils, vast assemblies of people would gather to witness the display of sacred relics, fragments of bones, cloth, or objects believed to have belonged to saints and martyrs. These relics were brought forth in ornate reliquaries of gold and precious stones, carried in solemn processions accompanied by clouds of incense and the haunting sounds of Gregorian chant. The emotional impact of these ceremonies was overwhelming, as medieval people believed these relics possessed miraculous powers. Participants would swear oaths of peace upon these sacred objects, believing that breaking such vows would invite divine retribution. Literary traditions underwent a remarkable transformation during this period. The emerging genre of chivalric literature began to redefine the warrior ideal. Works such as the Song of Roland and Perceval depicted knights who embodied both martial prowess and Christian virtues. These stories portrayed heroes who defended the weak, protected the church, and fought for justice rather than personal glory. The concept of courtly love, introduced in these works, further civilized the warrior class by emphasizing refined behavior and respect for women. Chroniclers and poets crafted narratives that celebrated knights who showed mercy to enemies and protected the defenseless, creating a new template for noble behavior. Intellectual developments in monasteries and emerging universities contributed to this cultural shift. Theologians and philosophers developed complex arguments about just war theory, building on the works of St. Augustine. They debated questions about legitimate authority, just cause, and proper conduct in warfare. These intellectual discussions resulted in the creation of sophisticated frameworks for understanding when violence could be justified and how it should be limited, ideas that would later influence international law. The visual arts became a powerful medium for conveying these new ideals. Romanesque architecture and art, characteristic of this period, incorporated these themes in striking ways. Church portals featured sculptures depicting the triumph of peace over violence, with intricate carvings showing the rewards of virtue and the consequences of sin. Tympanums often portrayed Christ as the Prince of Peace, surrounded by scenes of harmony and divine order. Frescoes and manuscripts illustrated the lives of warrior saints who had renounced violence for Christ, providing powerful role models for medieval knights. The development of heraldry and chivalric codes during this period reflected the new emphasis on regulated, honorable combat. Elaborate systems of heraldic symbols and colors helped identify knights on the battlefield, making warfare more orderly and personal. These visual systems became part of a complex language of honor and identity that helped transform the warrior class into a more disciplined and socially responsible force. Musical traditions also evolved to support this cultural transformation. Liturgical music incorporated themes of peace and divine protection, while troubadours composed songs celebrating noble deeds and courtly virtues. These musical traditions helped spread the new ideals of Christian knighthood throughout medieval society. The intellectual impact of these changes extended to legal thinking as well. Canon lawyers began developing sophisticated frameworks for understanding and regulating violence, creating precedents that would influence both ecclesiastical and secular law. The concept of sanctuary, where churches provided refuge from violence, became codified in legal systems throughout Europe. This cultural and intellectual revolution created lasting changes in how medieval society viewed violence and authority. The Church's use of ritual, literature, art, and intellectual discourse helped transform the warrior ethos from one of unbridled violence to one that emphasized protection, justice, and Christian virtue. These changes created enduring cultural templates that influenced European civilization long after the medieval period, shaping modern concepts of military honor, just war, and the protection of civilians during conflict. The Peace and Truce of God movements, while originating in southern France, did not exist in isolation. These initiatives spread across medieval Europe in complex waves of influence, adapting to local conditions and responding to various external pressures. The movement's evolution reveals a fascinating interplay between regional politics, external threats, and the Church's growing international authority. The success of these peace movements in France created a ripple effect across European territories. In the Germanic lands, local bishops modified the French model to accommodate the stronger imperial authority of the Holy Roman Empire. Rather than direct confrontation with the warrior nobility, they worked through imperial structures, incorporating peace agreements into imperial law. The German Peace of God, Gottesfrieden, became intertwined with the imperial peace Landfrieden, creating a unique hybrid that combined religious authority with imperial power. In Spain, the movement took on distinct characteristics shaped by the ongoing Reconquista against Muslim territories. Spanish clergy adapted the peace movements to support Christian unity against external threats while still protecting local populations from Christian warriors. Churches became not only sanctuaries from violence, but also strategic strongholds in the complex frontier society of medieval Iberia. The Spanish version of the peace movements emphasized the protection of agricultural areas and trade routes crucial for sustaining the Christian kingdom's military efforts. The Italian city-states presented another unique context. Here, the peace movements intersected with emerging communal governments. Urban bishops worked with merchant classes to establish peace zones around markets and trade routes, crucial for the commercial revolution taking place in medieval Italy. The Italian adaptation of these movements helped develop sophisticated legal frameworks for resolving conflicts between competing city-states and merchant families. External threats played a crucial role in shaping these movements. Viking raids along the northern coasts of Europe created an urgent need for organized defense systems. The peace movements helped coordinate responses to these threats while preventing internal conflicts from weakening defensive capabilities. In areas frequently targeted by Viking raids, local peace associations often developed into permanent defensive arrangements, combining religious authority with practical military organization. The Muslim presence in the Mediterranean region similarly influenced the movement's development. In Sicily and southern Italy, where Byzantine, Muslim, and Latin Christian influences converged, the peace movements had to account for complex interreligious relationships. The Church adapted its peace strategies to address not only Christian-Muslim conflicts, but also tensions between Eastern and Western Christian communities. The Crusades marked another crucial external factor that transformed these movements. As the Church redirected warrior energy toward the Holy Land, peace movements in Europe gained additional legitimacy. They could now offer local warriors an alternative path to glory and salvation through crusading, while maintaining peace at home. This dynamic created a sophisticated balance between local peacekeeping and external military activity. International trade networks also influenced the movement's spread and adaptation. Merchant communities, particularly those involved in the growing wool trade and international fairs, became strong supporters of peace initiatives. They helped establish protected trade routes and peace zones around major market centers, contributing to the economic transformation of medieval Europe. The movements also influenced diplomatic relations between medieval kingdoms. The Church's ability to impose peace became a tool in international diplomacy, with papal legates mediating conflicts between rulers using the peace movement's principles and procedures. This international dimension helped establish precedents for modern diplomatic practices. Cultural exchange played a significant role in the movement's evolution. The circulation of religious texts, legal documents, and diplomatic correspondence helped spread peace initiatives across Europe. Traveling clergy, merchants, and pilgrims carried ideas and practices from one region to another, creating a network of peace-promoting institutions and customs. The interaction with monastic networks, particularly the Cluniac system, provided crucial infrastructure for spreading these movements. Monasteries served as centers for developing and promoting peace initiatives, with monks acting as mediators and record keepers for peace agreements. The international nature of monastic networks helped standardize peace practices across diverse regions while allowing for local adaptation. These various external influences and interactions transformed the Peace and Truce of God from local French initiatives into a complex European phenomenon. The movement's ability to adapt to different political, social, and cultural contexts while maintaining their core principles of protecting the vulnerable and regulating violence demonstrates their remarkable flexibility and enduring relevance. This adaptability helped establish lasting frameworks for conflict resolution and social order that would influence European society for centuries to come. The Peace and Truce of God movements represent a remarkable medieval experiment that continues to influence modern approaches to conflict resolution and international law. Their legacy extends far beyond their immediate historical context, offering valuable insights into how societies can regulate violence and promote social change through moral authority and institutional innovation. The movement's most enduring legacy can be seen in the development of international humanitarian law. The basic principle that warfare should have limits and that civilians deserve protection has become a cornerstone of modern international conventions, including the Geneva Conventions. The medieval attempt to create protected categories of people and places during conflicts foreshadowed contemporary concepts of human rights and civilian immunity during warfare. These movements also pioneered innovative approaches to conflict resolution that remain relevant today. The use of public ceremonies, sworn oaths, and community enforcement mechanisms demonstrated how social pressure and moral authority could be leveraged to modify behavior, even among powerful actors. Modern peacekeeping operations and conflict resolution strategies often employ similar principles of community involvement and moral suasion. The transformation of warrior culture through these movements offers important lessons for contemporary efforts to reform military institutions. The Church's success in gradually redirecting martial energy toward protective rather than predatory purposes suggests how deeply ingrained cultural practices can be modified without being completely suppressed. This understanding remains valuable for societies attempting to reform military cultures while maintaining effective defense capabilities. The movement's influence on legal development extends beyond warfare regulations. Their emphasis on protecting economic activities and establishing safe zones for trade contributed to the development of commercial law and international trade regulations. The concept that certain activities and spaces should remain protected during conflicts has evolved into modern ideas about neutral territories and protected economic zones. Perhaps most significantly, these movements demonstrated the potential for institutions to effect positive social change through nonviolent means. The Church's use of moral authority, ritual, and community mobilization to constrain violence offers a model for how institutions can promote social transformation without resorting to force. This legacy is particularly relevant for contemporary organizations working to reduce violence and promote peace in conflict-affected regions. The Peace and Truce of God movements also left a lasting impact on political theory. Their assertion that even the most powerful members of society must be subject to moral and legal constraints helped establish the principle of rule of law. The idea that legitimate authority must protect the vulnerable rather than simply exercise power continues to influence modern concepts of good governance and state responsibility. These medieval innovations in peace-building and conflict management remain surprisingly relevant to contemporary challenges. From international peacekeeping operations to community-based conflict resolution programs, many modern approaches echo the fundamental insights of these movements. That violence can be regulated through a combination of moral authority, community engagement, and institutional innovation. As global society continues to grapple with questions of legitimate violence, civilian protection, and conflict resolution, the legacy of these medieval peace movements offers both inspiration and practical insights. Their success in gradually transforming a deeply violent society suggests that patient, persistent efforts to promote peace can yield significant results, even in the most challenging circumstances. Understanding this legacy is crucial for anyone working to promote peace and justice in today's world. The movements remind us that successful social change requires not just good intentions, but also practical mechanisms, community engagement, and a deep understanding of how to transform rather than simply suppress existing social structures. If you've enjoyed this exploration of medieval peace building, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel. Join us next time as we continue our journey through history's most fascinating moments.